Okay, guys, first of all, thank you for having me. Thank you, Lauren. Thank you for Rotaract for having me. This is a pilot of a series of lectures and webinars that we're organizing together. Also, I'd like to thank you for your time, because if you are here connected on Friday afternoon talking about lobbying, you must be a very interesting person. So I wish I could meet you in a different environment. What are we going to do today? Today we're going to discuss about lobbying, and the main objective of this webinar is in fact to provide a really basic understanding of European lobbying. I specify European lobbying. Lobbying is a phenomenon that has many facets. I feel confident only in reporting about the European Union, and see this webinar as a way to provide rudiments. So rudiments of policy and rudiments of European lobbying applied to those politics. I will also try to be as practical as I can be so that it's easier for you to grasp some of the elements that we will be discussing. Some rules for this webinar, as mentioned at the beginning, this is being recorded. So don't worry, we will provide you all the materials that we will be discussing today, including the slides of the presentation, including the recording. I'll try to keep this webinar as interactive as possible. I don't think that anyone in 2020 post-corona can still give a one-directional presentation and still get away with it. So I'll try to keep interactive, which means that there will be at least 3 parts, or in 3 moments of the presentation, I will ask you to contribute. I will ask you to pick up your smartphone and join me in an online polling system. And I will also guide you through some online tools that will also invite you to see for yourself. Very quickly on myself, my name is Andrea Boccuni. I'm originally from Italy. I've been living abroad for half of my professional life. I am working for a big chemical company, German company called BASF, and I'm senior governmental affairs there. In my professional life, I've been working in the European Parliament. I was parliamentary assistant for a few months. I've been working in the European Commission in DG Sante, the Director General for Health and Food Safety, as a food fraud expert. But in general, I'm a big nerd of lobbying, and I love it so much that I like to teach it, and possibly whenever I can, I teach it to MBA students or other kind of students. I've been mostly dealing with agri-food topic, so I'm an agri-food lobbyist by background, but I also touch upon certain elements of life sciences and health, and I'll bring some example later on. However, for what is most interesting for this exercise, I also would like to share the fact that I've been working with NGO for many years. I am senior fellow at the Good Lobby, which is an NGO that teaches about lobbying to other organizations, civil society organizations and NGOs. And I've been acting as head of partnership and education for 4 years. In this capacity, I've been training an important number of organizations, and also had the chance, the honor, and the possibility of teaching to grantees of some high-level foundations in Europe, which means that I have the chance to have a full understanding of how NGO conduct their lobbying activity, how that can be improved, and how can NGO benefit from the support of professional experts such as lawyers or lobbyists. That's it. Now it's one of the parts of the presentation where I will ask you to tell me what you think. And I think the best way to do so is to pick up your smartphone and to go on menti.com. What I want to do with you is that I want to break the ice. This is a difficult topic. There's a lot people think about what lobbying is or isn't. And I think the most interesting way for me to show it to you is to ask you directly. Give me a 30 seconds. Very well. Wait. No, it's my fault. You should have started from the first question. Yes, here we are. So I would say let's start with an icebreaker. So very plainly, can you see my screen, by the way? Or that has went blank?
We can see.
Perfect. Very well. Let me join Mentimeter as well. Ah, cute. Perfect. If I say lobbying, what words come to your mind? Don't think too much. Give me your gut reaction. I love House of Cards, actually. That's very interesting.
Trying to convince people who might be in charge of legislation to go one way instead of another.
That's a fair point. As a matter of fact, usually the words that come up more often is persuasion. However, I would like to challenge that. If my job is to persuade you, wouldn't I be a marketeer? Why do I have to be a lobbyist then? What's the difference between lobbying and marketing if my job is just to convince you? It's an open question. Everybody can answer in chat or just unmute your mic. And
in marketing, you usually persuade customers to buy your product or service, whereas in lobbying, you persuade lawmakers, legislators, politicians, or other parties who have a role on deciding and enacting legislation.
Elare, absolutely yes. The difference between marketing and lobbying is that at the end of the day, we want to change the law. So we have a strong legal, administrative, and regulatory focus that makes us sometimes closer to lawyers than to communication specialists as such. Thank you very much. Next question. What do you think is the most important element of lobbying? You can rank from 1 to 5. Very well. Very well. I love the fact that you highlighted money. I think this is one of the wildest misunderstood elements of lobbying. Let me give an example. Tobacco companies. Since the beginning, tobacco companies have been pouring money into the legislative process more than ever, but that doesn't mean that more money necessarily equals more policy outcomes. There will be no way in which no money in the world can buy the fact that you cannot enter a hospital and start smoking, or you cannot enter a cinema and start smoking. So although it is definitely true that more resources may give more access, it's not absolutely true that money specifically translates into policy outcomes. As a matter of fact, if I would be taking the same question, I would put first the strong legal background. This is what we do at the end of the day. We can change things, we can influence and shape the regulatory environment surrounding a particular law, but only if we can. Only if the regulatory environment is set in such a way that allow our contribution to be meaningful. No money in the world will necessarily change policy as such. Third question, how transparent is lobbying in the EU? And be very careful to anyone saying somehow transparent, because then I want to know why somehow. Does any of you feels like sharing why he or she put somehow transparent?
If I can go.
Please.
I mean, I know there is a register so that everyone that lobbies has to register and has to share a lot of information. But when I look at that, so to find maybe some internships and stuff, the sites were not always accurate. They were inaccurate. They were not updated, and so it was transparent, but it wasn't. It felt like it wasn't checked again. So I mean.
So you look at the transparency register of the European Union to look for a job? Do you want to be a colleague of mine?
Maybe, who knows?
You're welcome, of course. Very well. I thank you for your contribution. I will get back to this during the slide because I think the question around transparency is one of the most interesting. Now, careful to this one. Are diffuse interests like environment, health, opposed to particular interests? Natasha, just let me address your reward. The register is mandatory in the EU, only for some institutions, and now more and more institutions are picking it up to an extent that it's very likely that the transparency register will cover the activities of all the institutions in a matter of few years. So I would argue that in fact the EU is even more transparent than the US. Okay, are diffuse interest opposed to particular interest? Thank you for your contribution. I will get back to this very question very soon. But it's interesting to see that at least there is a no there, but also not sure. Can you think of any successful corporate lobbying campaign? Usually if you think of a campaign, people think of Greenpeace, Friends of Earth, WWF. Can any of you think of a corporate lobby campaign? That's a very good one, in fact. The campaign that Uber did in order for the EU not to recognize it as a ride-handling company was very interesting. But here you're mentioning companies, not campaigns. How about campaigns? I'm sure Airbnb did something. In fact, they also did a very good campaign when, for similar reason as Uber, they wanted to be considered as not as a hostel services company. Lime did something very similar. I like who said nothing. I like honesty very well. Okay. Compulsory nutrition score on product. That's a very, very good one. Some people would argue that it's not necessarily a corporate campaign, although of course corporate actors are included. That has to do with the food information to consumer regulation and the fact of how do we manage the growing problem of obesity with education. Thank you for whomever put the veggie burger, and thank you for putting it in the basket of corporate lobbying. I have an interesting case study on that specifically. GMO labeling campaign. I've been having the honor of working with GMO producing company, and that wasn't successful from our side, unfortunately. But as well also wasn't successful from the side of the proponent of a label on GMO. I will not enter into detail because otherwise I will finish the rest of the presentation on that. But indeed, that's a very good example. We are getting towards the end, so just bear with me for a few more minutes. How do you measure lobbying? How do you measure lobbying? Or as my professor used to say in university, how do you measure the success of a cocktail party? That's very nice of you. Yes, regulatory change is definitely one of our strongest return of investment. Sometimes even my boss asks me, what do we do with all this money and how do we translate our webinar and invitation into regulatory change? So that's very true. Almost the last one, what's the EU law that you know the best? That's just for specialists. I don't expect you to be an expert in EU law, but just to see what's the general familiarity and literacy of European law. GDPR, that is very good. This is the General Data Protection Regulation, which is the reason why you need to accept terms and conditions in every site you browse. Okay, fair enough. Last but not least, how can students contribute to politics? Fair point. Sometimes people just simply forget about it. Interesting. Very well. That's definitely true. Yeah. These are all fair points. Very well. Okay. Very well. So that's the last one. By the way, I will also share with you the results of this Mentimeter to see if that can be useful for you at a later stage. Okay, well, thank you very much for your contribution. I think it's always interesting to break the ice to see what's people's perception of lobbying and also what are the basic elements of this understanding of lobbying. Before we go in the presentation, let me just clear some of these elements. Some of the definition that we will use in the context of this presentation, so feel free to disagree or not to be in line with what I'm just about to say. But for the purpose of this presentation, we define lobbying as the activity of contributing to the regulatory process. So there is a strong regulatory legal flavor in this. I really like your answer to particular interest, because sometimes, especially when we talk about lobbying, there is the misperception that public is always contraposed to private interest. So it's a continuum, and you have a black and white, and you have, on one hand, you find the good guys and the bad guys. With that question, I wanted to point out the fact that the reality is a bit more nuanced. And let me give you an example. So for example, a few years ago, I was working for the European Hematologist Association, so the European Association representing blood doctors, to be blunt. And in particular, they asked me to work on a campaign to raise awareness on leukemia, so blood cancer. This is a particular interest. When I was going and talking to the European Commission or the Parliament to present our campaign on leukemia, the same person, the same regulator, the same lawmaker was not meeting someone else with an equally important campaign to pitch. So let's imagine I work for Alzheimer's Disease Association. From the point of view of a lobbyist for Alzheimer's Patients Association, I, as working for the hematologist, I represent a competitor. So the fact that I'm representing a specific part of society, in this case, hematologist and raising awareness on leukemia, makes me a carrier of particular interest. There was also a very nice comment on the veggie burger ban. I think that's also an interesting point. The veggie burger ban refers to something that has happened 3 weeks ago in the context of the reformulation of the Common Agricultural Policy, the CAP, and the fact that one amendment in particular would have stopped plant-based product producers of using the word burger. It's like the soy milk that can be called milk. I found it very interesting because in many ways it felt like it was the green activism trying to fight the position of the meat-based industry. So a bit of one of those fights against the man. But the reality is that also the plant-based sector is a sector on its own rights. And behind the campaign to support the lift of the veggie ban, you would find companies like Unilever and Nestlé. So in fact, you see both interests working on both sides of the aisle. So when we talk about lobbying, we often talk about particular interests. These might be interests that belong to part of society. They could be a specific issue. They could be a specific geographic location, but they're not as such contraposed to public interest. And also, just a quick definition, I will refer to civil society a lot. And that is important because sometimes we have the feeling that only NGO represents civil society. But in fact, NGO or non-governmental organizations are a part of civil society. Civil society is bigger than that. It includes everyone. Includes retirees, includes students, professionals, teachers, workers, includes you guys in this call. And this is why I think it's important that, for example, when as the Good Lobby, we want to empower civil society, we don't necessarily mean that we want to empower NGO as such, but each and every one of you. And I will try to make a case for it. Now that brings us to where is the Good Lobby coming from and why do our work? Ultimately, we have three objectives as an organization. First of all, we want to demystify lobbying. We know that there is a lot of misunderstanding around the world of lobbying, and we want to debunk some of the myths that surround the lobbying. Why? Because once you demystify lobbying, you can give access to lobby tools to everyone. So at the end of the day, lobbying is not rocket science. It's just a way, it's an approach. It's a way, it's a philosophy of communication that can be literally endorsed by anyone who has an interest in having his or her voice heard. And lastly, we want to nurture, we want to cultivate a culture of pro bono. Maybe some of you might be familiar with the word pro bono, comes from Latin, means for free. And this is a practice that is commonly used by doctors and lawyers. So they provide their services for free. How about a lobbyist for free? How about a student for free? How about a university professor for free? How about an engineer for free? And so forth. So this is how civil society could, taking example from other parts of society, be functional to the NGO and the civil society sector. But one step at a time. We started at the Good Lobby in Brussels because we figure that the vast majority of organizations in Brussels, so Brussels-based NGOs, Greenpeace, WWF, Friends of Earth, BirdLife Watch, the majority of these organizations need legal support, which is interesting because you would expect organizations in Brussels to be good at Brussels' job. But we found that that's not the case. Sometimes organizations took advantage of pro bono support, but this is mostly for contracts, admin. So they do contracts, they do statutes, so administrative procedure, but never strategy. And we also figured out that the bigger an NGO, the more likely is the organizations to make use of pro bono. So Greenpeace is definitely in touch with lawyers and experts in how they shape their own campaign. But what happens to all the other associations that are not Greenpeace and that are equally representing civil society? And this is basically our starting point. How can we bridge the expertise from civil society, lawyers, experts, lobbyists, engineers, professors, with the work of NGOs? Before answering this question, I will continue with the quiz. And I would like you to take a moment to reflect and to think, which are the top most active lobby organizations in Brussels? Who lobbies the most in Brussels? Maybe you're thinking of Google, maybe you're thinking of Tesla, maybe you're thinking of Putin. And also take a moment to think of which are the organizations that spend the most. And since we're there, who's the richest member of the European Parliament? For all the Italians in the room, Berlusconi is an MEP right now, but he's not the richest, I'm sorry. Okay, to answer these questions, I would like us to go to the Integrity Watch. Can you see my screen?
Yeah.
So basically, to that person that answered that there is a transparency register in the EU, this is absolutely true. I would actually argue that the transparency register in the EU is possibly one of the most interesting transparency tools overall. Here you see a tool, an online tool from Transparency International, a leading global NGO dealing with transparency, that draws data from the European Transparency Register and place them in a way that are more, let's say, user-friendly. Here on the right side, you see the top 10 organizations lobbying. Do you recognize any of this organization? Very well. We will spend a few minutes on this website, so take your time to go through it, or even visit it your own. Here on the left side, we see instead who are the top. You know, lobbying is a tango. You need two people, you need two parties. So if I'm lobbying a lot, who's receiving my lobbying effort? Here you see on the left side, the recipient of lobbying activities. How many of you, or who could tell me who is Stella Kyriakides?
I think she's the Greek Commissioner for Food and Drug Administration for the European Union.
80% correct. She's from Cyprus.
Okay. Because speaking Greek, I was confused there.
No, indeed. She's a Greek speaker, of course. And indeed, as you said, she is responsible for health and food safety as well.
Yes.
Very well. So because of that, because of the fact that she is responsible for health and being, for the grace of God, under COVID, of course, she's one of the most lobbyist person at this point. Any of you knowing, would you happen to know anyone else in this list? Perfect, that's not a problem. You don't have to. You don't have to.
There's Frans Timmermans, that I think I know from the media.
He is Vice President of the European Commission, indeed. Yes.
Yeah.
And let me break it down into more granularity. So the fact that we as a lobbyist have to be registered, it means that every time we have any kind of interaction with European institutions, that interaction will be tagged. So not only the institution know exactly who I am, who I work for, what's the budget my company have reserved for lobbying, if I have a budget for European Parliament, how many times I meet with European Commission. You would also see what do we talk about. So the subject of lobby meetings is also recorded. And the aggregated data for this information comes here. See, subject of lobby meetings. Now here you see a bunch of words, that's a word cloud of subjects of lobby meetings. My question to you is, which words you do not see? Take a moment. Anything? Please.
So I can't see children, students, or families.
That's a very good point. It is also fair to say that not necessarily the European Commission might be responsible for those policy areas. Sometimes we tend to think that the EU is like a member state. It's like a state that does stuff. Europe has a court and enforces law and implements law. Not really. There are certain elements of policy where Europe is exceptionally strong. A good example is agriculture. 40% of European budget goes to agriculture. But there are other policy areas where Europe does absolutely little. For example, foreign policy. So every time you have a problem in Libya, you will see France and Germany to run up to it, and not the US or even Belarus, for example. Culture, youth policies, and family policies tend to be very national, but you raise a very fair point. You don't see those words there. Anyone? Any other idea?
I don't see anything about budget either.
Aha. That's a very good point, in fact. That's a very good point.
As well, you can see neither peace nor war.
True that. Well, someone would raise the fact that you also don't see defense and an army there. So how can we make sure peace is kept around those borders? The words I do not see, and I still amazed that they're not there, is Brexit, number one. And fair point, I don't see migrant. And there was a whole, I was giving this kind of lecture in 2015 and 16, and I can tell you migrants were not there either. I think that creates a first discrepancy between what we call high politics. so Angela Merkel, Macron, and all the leaders, and law politics, which is the admin part. These are functionaries, civil servants. We lobbyists work here because these are the people that don't change every 5 years. So these are the people that actually know how policy are about. High politics is for newspaper, for journalists. We try to stay on the regulatory. Before we move to the next section, again, just feel free to enjoy this plentiness of data. For example, we talk about Stella Kyriakides. Are you interested in learning who has she met? You might be surprised to see that she met with the European Cancer Organization. She met with Animal Health Europe. She met with the Endocrine Society. She met with the chemical industry. When? Well, she met the 29th, or the 29th of August with CEFIC. So I think it's super interesting because you can really break down every commissioner, every policy area, and see who's lobbying what, when. You can, for example, there was a point on energy. Let's see who is lobbying in energy. Well, you see on the right screen, there is mostly trade association and companies. You see that these are usually director general, so they're not cabinet member. This is a cabinet member. And you can see the top 10 organization per topic. So you see here, for example, there is EDF, Shell, Iberdrola, Enel. I would say this is fairly representative of the energy market. Okay, let's not stop here. Part of the data that are shown on this website also connects to the actual lobbying activity. So I'm still in the same website. I moved here of a different tab. This is EU Lobbyist. I want to draw your attention on the left side of the screen. Here you see the top 10 countries that lobby the EU. So the first one is Belgium, but don't consider it because the majority of organizations have a headquarter in Belgium, so it's considered Belgium, but it's not really true. So you will have Japanese company like Fujitsu have an office in Belgium, so in the transparency register is Belgium, but it's not. So let's consider from the second entry on. So from Germany, France, UK, Spain, Italy, Netherlands. I think that here already you start to see some interesting political differences. So Germany, France, UK, Italy and Spain, up until this point, we're going about size. Germany is the biggest country in the EU. The second one is France. The third one is UK. The fourth one is Italy, but there's no Poland. The fifth biggest country in the EU is Poland. And Poland does very little lobbying compared to its size. Conversely, you see the opposite. The Netherlands is relatively little, 16 million people. That's, I don't know, a bit less than a third of Italy alone, and yet they lobby more than Austria and Switzerland, and comparably to Italy. So you also see which are the European member states that punch above their weight. And then some of you might be surprised to see US to being in the top 10 lobbying countries in the EU. To which I would say that that's not really surprising because if you think about it, everyone in this virtual room has a Gmail account, a Facebook account, an Instagram account. So we are their clients. So they are here lobbying because they want to stay close to us. Now, let's see also what other interesting information we can retrieve from the database. So in the previous tab, we look at the top 10 organization lobbying. Here we can see everyone else. We can see everyone else, and we have also comparable information on what do they do. Did you know that the European Environmental Bureau, a prominent NGO in Brussels, has actually a budget of 4.5 million and 32 lobbyists? It's interesting. Now, pay attention. Here they call lobby expenses. Lobbying expenses, it's a trick word. It's not your turnover. It's not the revenue of your organization. Are the money spent by that organization in lobbying activities? That can be drafting position papers, building campaigns, organizing events. Now more difficult because of COVID, but that gives you an idea. And these are the richest lobby groups. The first one is CEFIC, indeed the European chemical industry, with more than 10 millions and 82 lobbyists. 82 lobbyists are really, really many, in fact. But you also see Altro Consumo, a prominent Italian consumer group, spending a fair 5 million with only 6 lobbyists. What's happening there? You also see leading consultancies. You see, for example, FTI consultancies, Fleischmann Hillard, Barston Cohn & Wolf, also called Barston Marcellus. I'm reading from the chat box, Airbus in top 10, while Boeing is the biggest lobbyist in the US. Why do aircraft company lobby so much? It's more complicated. It's not about aircraft company, it's about jobs. So Airbus, similarly like Boeing in US, it's a gigantic industrial complex that touches upon 4 member states and a few 100,000 jobs, high-skilled jobs. So considering that their market is in strong flexion because of COVID, European saves jobs. European money saves jobs, as easy as that. So they don't have to refund tickets to the pandemic. Fair enough, they build planes, they don't run flights, but fair enough. This is interesting. Bruegel, this is a think tank. How many of you are familiar with the phenomenon of think tanks? Think tanks are universities without students. And these are also an interesting way of providing political support by creating argumentation and policy paper that support certain policies. This is a very US approach to politics, but 5 million there, it's an interesting way of punching in the lobbying environment. You have Shell, you have Facebook, but you have WWF. Would you have ever imagined that WWF Spain spend more in lobbying than Facebook? It's interesting. So yeah, these are some of the elements you can see there. Last but not least, you can also start seeing the meeting per MEP, members of the European Parliament. So here you find who met, when, and what. So members of the European Parliament purposefully and publicly giving away all the meetings they have with lobbyists. I think this is a beautiful trend, and I think we will see more of this transparency. So yeah, that I suppose it creates a case for the fact that the EU is at least more transparent. Now, did you expect to find so much information out there? Did you expect it to be so transparent?
No, to be honest, and I think this is a problem because usually we European citizens, we don't know about this website and this data that are out there available, and I cannot understand why.
But I would also raise a point. I agree that transparency is the building block of trust in politics, but what then? What do you do with transparency? The fact that these informations are out there, how do translate into better policymaking? How do translate into a more inclusive political decision process? I'm asking, and this is a purposefully provocative question, because, for example, in Italy, we had a whole tradition of political entrepreneurs that based their claim on transparency. We wanted to be transparent for the sake of transparency, and now this party happens to be in the government, and all this transparency haven't necessarily changed neither the relations between citizen and the electorate, nor necessarily politics itself. So I am absolutely happy as a lobbyist in Brussels that transparency is increasing, but as a citizen, I'm questioning the role. Okay, the message I wanted to give with this example is the following. So we saw the top 10 organizations lobbying the European Union in this moment. We find usual suspects. We find trade union, we find Airbus, we find the European Federation of Pharmaceutical Companies, we find the American Chamber of Commerce. But you know what? guess what you see in the top 10 lobbying organizations in Brussels? You find 1, 2, and 3 NGOs, which is interesting, because how could I suspect that WWF met more the Commission than Google? And I obviously understand that there is a huge difference in magnitude of resources between these two actors. That's why I said that money in and of itself don't necessarily buy you access. But if you have WWF so exposed and so visible towards the institution, then they must be damn good at their job. Which then helped me raising the final point of this presentation. Well, after what you saw, would you say that this business overrepresented? What do you think? Anyone?
How can it be overrepresented since we saw that at least three are NGOs in top 10 lobbies in the EU?
Pretty fair. Exactly. I would actually argue the opposite. It might sound counterintuitive, but I wouldn't say that necessarily business is overrepresented, because business will always be there. I would argue that is the opposite. It's civil society that is underrepresented. And that within those window of opportunities that NGOs or civil society organizations have been given to talk to the institutions and talk to policymakers, they should be the best possible lobbyists in town. And here comes the question, how do we professionalize NGO sector? And this is where organizations like ours, but of course we're not the only one, organizations like ours create an opportunity to merge and to find capacity in the professional sector. It could be lawyers, lobbyists, professors, or technicians with NGOs. I think the best example of all are university professors. They are the most misunderstood professionals in the planet. They are super expert of stuff. Nobody reads what they do. And at the same time, they could be a great source of technical capacity for any organizations that is working on technical issue. Imagine you're working in energy or environment or migration issues. So it was interesting for me in 4 years of working with NGO to realize how little would NGO know of the regulatory environment they want to work in. I'll bring some example from the migration issue because I was working a lot with the Good Lobby, especially in 2016. So you may remember absolutely that in 2015-16, there were many cases of migrants. We had all those deaths in the Mediterranean. And so you would see many organizations that wanted to get a foot in the door. They would ask us for a meeting, the European Parliament, they would ask us for a meeting with the Commission, they would ask us for a meeting with the President. And every time I would go to those organizations and say, yes, of course, let's organize an event in the Parliament. By the way, the EU is not competent on migration. You need to lobby at member state level. Or you would also find organizations that provide politics with policy input that are not based on the law. They're just basically wishful thinking. And the policy on the other side, the civil servant cannot support you, cannot help the capacity that you're bringing there. So unfortunately, if we're dealing with politics and policy, we have to go through the boring part, the regulation, the laws, and the administrative part. The good news is that you don't have to do it yourself. You can contact a pro bono lawyer, you can engage with those parts of society who provide support pro bono, and see what happens. This is what we do at the Good Lobby, basically. So what we do is to teach lobbying literally for dummies. So these are part of 101 lectures of lobbying. What you are experiencing today is basically lesson number 0. But if we were to continue this journey, we would normally bring you and your organizations up to speed. And we'll teach you on how to do your homework, how to do stakeholder mapping, how to come up with a lobby strategy, how to develop coalitions based on your policy objectives, how to fundraise, how to reach out for media, how to have meetings with politicians, and so forth. So part of our job is literally to teach and to guide civil society in working in a more professional manner. Other things that we do is that we support organizations ourselves with our pool of lawyers and experts. A good example of that is the work we've done together at Transparency International in 2014 in preparing the whistleblowing directive. The whistleblowing directive is that overarching piece of policy that protects those who expose fraudulent behavior in organizations. In Italy, we have something similar for those who go against criminal organization, mafias. But this is the case for companies that expose the behavior of, I don't know, banks or similar financial institutions. And we were really happy after an extremely long and painful campaign that was actually, it became legislation. So here you see one of policy area that no political parties wanted necessarily to be associated with, but civil society, together with our support of lawyers, we were able to get that through. Just some other examples of things that can be done in support of civil society. We've been working together, Ashoka, which is a network of social entrepreneurs. Specifically, there we're supporting migrant entrepreneurs, and we help them lobbying the Nordic Council and the Swedish Ministry of Education and Employment to get fund, supports, and recognition for the work they were doing in creating social cohesion. Not many people know that because of the migration crisis in 2015 and 16, 10% of Sweden is not Swedish. So in this moment, Sweden is working a lot with social cohesion practices and inclusion policies to make the best of these resources. We worked and lobbying for foundations. Did you know that every money you give in charity, especially in some member states, the foundation pays a VAT on that charity, so you pay taxes on charity? There are only 2 member states where this doesn't happen. One is the Netherlands. But in this case, we were working with a Serbian foundation, so a non-EU foundations, and we helped them to advocate for a more favorable fiscal regime for VAT recovery, as you would do as a freelancer. You get your VAT back from the state. Eurogroup for Animal. For any one of you in this room being vegan or particularly close to the topics of animal rights, we've been working very closely with Eurogroup for Animal, which is the biggest European parliamentary intergroup on animal rights. And we gave continuous trainings on legal stuff. Again, even though they are the biggest intergroups in the parliament, they do need legal support. For example, we've been coming up with interesting legal ways of enforcing a logo that would go on meat product to check what was the condition of those animals. And depending on the animal, what was the way in which this animal was raised. So free-caged chickens or similar case also in poultry and swine and cows. So these are just some of the examples of what can you, as a student or as an expert, or later on in your career as a professional, do to support the cause that you're interested in. You could be working as a volunteer, you could be supporting organizations that you really like, or you can simply be able to connect with those topics that resonate with you and your interest. Any questions so far? We're towards the end, so feel free to ask.
Aren't there also political lobbies in the EU that move towards specific foreign policy? For example, the sanctions to Belarus was from the EU was coordinated by a number of lobbies from Baltic states, for example.
No, I wouldn't say so. Unfortunately, the EU is exceptionally weak when it comes to foreign policies. We
can see.
Yeah, but to be super honest with you, that was made on purpose because member states don't want to let go their prerogative of national interest and defense. Sanctions are an interesting way for the EU to try to be influential. Sanctions against Russia after a few years started to be felt. Sanctioning is a prerogative of the European Commission DG Just, and could be fair to say that a bunch of member states, including Nordic and Baltic countries, might have asked for an exacerbation of the existing law. And that's a good point, because, for example, you would have seen in the past few years that France tried to grow closer relations with Russia in a anti-Chinese function. So you see countries like in the Baltics or Finland that are worried about that. And countries such as Sweden really ramped up their military capacity and military strategy, as they haven't done so since the end of the Cold War. So yeah, unfortunately, Europe is not yet grown up in foreign policies.
Yes, I understand, but there is still a provision, I think, in the European Treaty for functioning of the EU, which says that, for example, if a European member is attacked by a third power, which is not a European member, all member states have to contribute and defend this country, right?
But Belarus is not part of the EU, right?
I know, but for example, okay, let's take the example of Greece, which was and Cyprus, which both were asking for sanctions against Turkey.
Yeah.
We see a hesitation from certain member states.
This goes well beyond the scope of this presentation. So now we're talking about geopolitics. Geopolitics doesn't work with the same rules of politics. So you cannot use the same rules you use in politics to tackle an issue like that. Now we go into a different field. The problem there is that Turkey is a NATO member. And so the set of powers that creates balance in Europe, US, has not yet taken a strong position against Turkey. This is changing because because lately Turkey has become very aggressive. A good example is against Cyprus when it comes to oil field find in front of Israel, and that created a spat with France. Also, Turkey is actively influencing a bunch of wars, Libya, Georgia, Syria, creating friction with the other powers in the region, including Russia and Egypt. So this is creating a situation by which we can obstacle, or at least create some, we try to contain what Turkey is doing. Unfortunately, that's a completely different game. In geopolitics, we have other rules. These are the rules of powers, equilibrium of powers, mutual cooperation. So,
yes, I just asked that because I thought that maybe political lobbies also are involved in geopolitics.
When you go that high, lobbyism changes. We say normally that when it's about millions of euro, you lobby. When it's about billions of euro, the state lobbies for you. So we go to a point where the influence of big corporation is negligible. People are always looking at corporation like the roots of all evil, but they forget that states are way more powerful than many corporations. So every time you see people, Merkel and Putin meeting in China, they are mostly talking about economy, they're mostly talking about strategic national interest, and they are implemented through companies. So here it's a difficult discussion. Lobbying at that point stopped being a thing. It's like the Champions League and the national soccer league. These are just two different magnitudes of capacity. No, you don't lobby at that point. Member states and powers are way more influential than any corporate lobbies could ever be.
Okay, I understand. Thank you.
Yeah, it was impressive to see, well, all information that is actually quite transparent, but I totally agree with the point. How do you transform this transparency in a truly capacity that someone can process this information and do something about it, right? Because it's not the same, it's on our hands that we can make something good out of it. And so I understood the point of the lobby, of the good lobby. My question is, do you only work with civil society organizations, or would you also take like a corporate clients if you agree with the goals? And the second question is, the distribution you commented on the top list about how many NGOs and how the business world is represented. Do you think it would be the same if we would look at the lobbying of companies, for instance, in Germany or in France, at the member state level?
Point. That's a very good point. I address the first question first. Normally, corporations have that capacity. They have a lot of legal support. They have a lot of in-house capacity. So normally, we do this with NGOs, and with companies, we do the inverse job. So we invite them and we create a culture for their pro bono to flourish. I'll give you an example. The European Commission alone employs 35,000 people. According to the rules of the European Commission, every employee has 1 day of pro bono. Nobody does it because nobody knows how to provide this pro bono. But imagine you manage to vehicle and to channel all this capacity. You have the top expert of the administrative field to support NGOs in things like, I don't know, funding or Horizon 2020 project. So it's interesting because, as a matter of fact, from my experience, I realized that there is way more offer for help than demand. So you find hordes of lawyers that are willing to support and a handful of organizations that are interested in receiving that support, which is counterintuitive because you go to an NGO and you say, have you managed to change the law? No, because the law is too complicated. Why haven't you called a lawyer? Because we can afford, but the lawyer is for free. And so you would expect them to come towards you. But then you realize there is also some silos mentality. There is also about ideology. If I'm an NGO, I don't want to be seen with Google. If I am WWF, I don't want to be seen with BMW. So there is also some ideology back there that defies the concept of impact versus recognition. But that's a different discussion. And then what you say is absolutely interesting. Lobbying at member state or at any state for what it matters should and could be measured. It is fair to say that many member states in Europe are providing themselves with regulatory registry and transparency registry. You find one in Portugal, Croatia, Czech Republic, and it's growing. As usual, it's a bit of, there has to be some balance. You want lobbying to be transparent, but there are certain interests that are so ingrained in your society that you cannot pretend they're not there. I'll just take an example. Italy, we have Alitalia, which is our flying companies. Every 3 years, Italian taxpayer save and keep on paying for that. Why? Because you represent Italy, because it represents jobs, because you represent growth, even though it's a total failure of a company. You see this happening to various degrees in any states at any moment. You see now more because of Corona, in fact.
Thank you.
Anything else? Don't be afraid to use the chat box as well. And thank you for bearing with me for almost an hour, by the way. We're going a bit over time.
I was wondering, how does it look in practice, like the lobbying? So do the organizations just send an email to the person they would like to talk to, or or several emails, whatever? Like how does it work in practice? Are there several people below that actual person you want to talk to involved, or can you reach out to this person directly? Thank you.
It really depends. Usually politicians are a bit like Shakira, so they have an entourage of people around them. So you interact with their staff. But the majority of the times you don't necessarily need politicians because, as we said, a lot of the technical regulatory work happens below the radar. So these are officials, these are functionaries, these are civil servants, and they are usually there to serve you. So they pick up the phone if you call them, and they answer your email if you ask for a specific question. With politicians, it's a bit different, but you don't always need the parliament. You don't always need a cabinet. Certain issues stay on the regulatory side. When you're dealing with issue that goes into the political level, then yes, then you establish interaction with politicians. But to answer your question, more than I would ever love to admit, our job is a rather boring job. We spend, I don't know, every day starts with news and legislation monitoring. I need to be on top of what's happening. Then you do a lot of phone calls with mostly internal stakeholders, so representative of the industry, representative of other association, representative of political parties you're working with. And then you would do a bunch of conversation with politicians, but if that once a week is a lot, because of COVID now you do a lot of digital advocacy. So we are a lot on social media, we are a lot on webinars and online conferences. So yeah, at the end of the day, it's more boring than you expect. And that has a lot to do with digesting, processing, and sharing information. What it's in for the politicians who are lobbied to. What's in for them? Technical expertise. That's what's for them. A politician is, at the best of his or her capacity, someone that has a job. So imagine you're a doctor and become a politician. Can you become an expert in energy as well? Not necessarily. So we produce technical capacity that it's needed. The same question goes for the European Commission, in fact. A commission is just an office with a bunch of people. They cannot be expert on everything at every level. So industry usually provides facts and data. I'll give an example. I was working for the insect industry a few years ago. We were promoting the use of insect-based product for feed, animal feed, aquaculture specifically. To my client, I would go and say, look, we have lobbied the European Commission and we are awesome. The reality is that the Commission itself was using our argument and our data to lobby against another part of the European Commission. Because politics is not a monolith. You don't have just one mind, one vision. The Ministry of Environment has a very different position than the Ministry of Employment. The Ministry of Agriculture has a different position than the Ministry of Agriculture, of Environment. So our position was important for the Ministry of Environment to counter the lobby of our competitors, the cereal sector in that specific instance. So there was an instance brought forward by DG Agriculture. So in fact, also, especially the institutions lobby against each other and lobbying against themselves. And this happens at every administrative level in any place. You find the same struggle at the municipal level when you elect a mayor. You find the same exact lobbying level within the city of your region when some monies are available. Think about European Capital of Culture, think about the Olympic Games. So these are just rules of interaction between actors that have different interests within a certain environment. How is corruption kept in check in lobbying within the EU? Because it's totally inappropriate to do anything that goes against ethical rules. Every interaction, for example, we cannot pay anything to an MEP. Every gift should be below 40 euro. And also, as a matter of fact, the majority of money drawn by politicians are at national level during electoral campaign. Electoral campaigns are very expensive, so they get money from their sponsor. European elections don't work the same way. So you would have to have asked how is corruption kept in check at member state level and how that translates to the EU. And that's also relatively different from how it works in US, for example, where the financing and donation to politicians are institutionalized through political action committees. So I would say there is little to no corruption in the EU. When it comes to the work with the institutions in the bubble, of course, there is corruption in many other fields that are close or tangent to politics. But I would say, and also coming from a country that is famous for its corruption level, I would say Europe is rather okay. Guys, it's Friday afternoon. I'd love to talk about politics forever, but shoot your final question before I let you go. Nothing? I was all taking, by the way.
Okay, great. If there are no more questions, then I want to thank you, Andrea, for giving this very interesting lecture today. And I want to thank everybody for joining today. We will be posting the recording online, as mentioned, as well as some keynotes from today's presentation and the website where you can find all the information about the Good Lobby, as well as the register website. Thanks again, Andrea. And if you thought that today was a very interesting webinar, then because of the speaker as well, then we have some good news, as there will be a webinar on the 18th of November as well, so next Wednesday, which again everybody is invited to, which we will post on our Facebook and all our other channels. So thank you for joining us today. Thank you, Andrea. And I think that's it.
Thank you all, and feel free to reach out via LinkedIn, via email, via social media. We're here to stay. Thank you again for your time.
Thank you.